Hello again, and welcome back to the That Was Stupid podcast, where we have candid conversations on taking chances and proving everyone wrong. And today we have a treat for you. We have Jason Romano on the show. Now, Jason, you might not recognize the name right away, but you definitely know his work. See, Jason spent almost 2 decades at ESPN, and by the end of his time and the height of his career at ESPN, he was one of the producers on the Mike and Mike show, which was the top-rated radio show on the entire network. It was on radio. It was also on TV. But Jason, at the height of his career, decided that he was done. He decided that he was going to take a drastic, leap of faith is what you could call it in every sense of the term. And so he left ESPN to go to this small nonprofit to tell stories of consequence. And so today we are going to talk to Jason about what that was like, the people around him at the time that said that was stupid, the reaction from people like Mike Greenberg and Mike Golick, the recognizable names on ESPN that he was working for, and then what's transpired since he made that big decision. But before we get into it, hey, remember to like and subscribe to the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe there. You can also watch it on Spotify as well. And hey, if you want to reach out to me, to us, to suggest guests, if you have questions or anything, you can email us at guest@thatwasstupid.show. So listen, before we go, I just want to let you know how awesome the reaction has been. Thank you for your comments on social media, your shares, your likes. We really appreciate it. So without further ado, let's get right into it and start our conversation with Jason Romano. Jason Romano, thank you so much for joining the That Was Stupid podcast. I am so excited to have you on the show. Again, thank you.
Hey, John, what's going on, buddy? I love the title of your show, by the way. That was stupid. I'm thinking, where are we going with this? And then you realize what it's about. And I'm like, yep, I think we can all relate to doing something maybe that others might perceive as being a little stupid. So I'm here for it, my friend. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. And I love the fact that we can run the gamut on a lot of it, right? Like I had Miss America on the show. I've had someone who decided to give clean water to the world, right?
Yes.
Quit his job to give clean water. And now you, right? And I want to talk about your decision to leave the number one show on ESPN at the time and go to doing something that you really felt called to do. So I want to get into that today. But for those who may not know you, and we'll get into your history, but what are you doing right now?
Right now, I am sitting in my office at the house in Connecticut, and it's actually sunny and 70 today, so I'm not complaining.
Ooh.
But what I'm actually doing is I am the director of media for a ministry called Sports Spectrum, which is also a media company. So it's media, but it's also ministry. What we do is we tell stories. We have a media platform, podcast network. We have our website, our quarterly magazine. And the goal for what we do, the desire for what we do, is to have stories of sports intersecting with faith. And Jesus's story is the most important story in my life and in my world. And there's so many other athletes and coaches out there who feel the same way. And what we want to do is highlight those stories because, not a lot of platforms are doing that. And there are a lot of athletes, prominent athletes, big name athletes who love Jesus. And we want to highlight those stories. So that's what I'm doing now. I host our Sports Spectrum podcast, and I lead a small team that has done amazing work and churns out tons of content for the little engine that could, if you will, which is our team. And I love what Sports Spectrum's been about. And just so you know, John, you may not know this, Sports Spectrum's been around since 1985. So we're just standing on the shoulders of those before us who conceived the idea and continued to want to tell these stories of sports and faith for so many years. And now we get to carry the torch for a little bit.
Yeah, and in fact, people who are watching this episode on YouTube or Spotify, the book behind me, Finding Rest, which we've talked about, I
Yep.
actually include a line or a quote from Sports Spectrum in there, right? Because
Yes.
Reggie White is part of my story of kind of understanding, how to navigate tragedy, and so yeah, that was kind of a fun connection point when we talked about that. So yes, it's been around forever. Now, before though, you and I met in, I want to say it was probably about 2016 ish.
Hmm.
We went to a conference. We met at a conference, a storytelling conference, right? Which was awesome. And you and I had lunch, and you started talking about some rumblings. And at the time, you were the producer on the Mike and Mike show for ESPN Radio, which was
One of them. Yeah, there was like
yeah,
five producers,
sure,
but yes, I
which
wasn't
was
the producer.
a huge hit, right? I mean, everyone was listening to Mike and Mike back then, but you started getting some rumblings of like, I maybe there's something else here. So walk us through how did you get to ESPN? Let's talk about that first, and
Yeah.
then that transition.
Yeah, it was one of those kind of random things, if I'm being honest. I mean, I would hope I would have earned the right to work at ESPN, uh, but I'm not sure that I did. I think I was just in the right place at the right time. It was 23 years ago. It was July 18th, 2000. I'll never forget the day when I started my job at ESPN. It was 2 years earlier that I actually applied for my first job at ESPN on a whim on the internet of all places, which was still new at that time in 1998. And I got called to come to Bristol, Connecticut to interview. I didn't get the job, but it at least got my name in the door, if you will, on the pages of some of the bosses, so that 2 years later, I was working as a local radio producer in Albany, New York. I loved my job. I was in my hometown. I wasn't getting paid a lot, but I was working in the business that I always wanted to work in. But ultimately, I wanted to work in sports full time. And 2 years later, in the year 2000, around April or so, I came across the same job that I had applied for 2 years earlier, and I just applied again. And it's funny, the story goes that I went to my wife that day after I applied, and I came home. We had just been married a few months, and I said, I just want you to know, I know we just moved into this new house and everything, but we're going to be moving out in a couple months because I applied for a job at ESPN today. And when they call and when they offer the job, I'm going to accept it. And when I accept it, we're going to move to Bristol, Connecticut. And she was kind of like, what in the world did you
Wow.
just say? And I said, no. And honestly, when I said that to her, John, I was kidding. I didn't really think any of
Okay.
that was going to happen. I just wanted to, we're new in our marriage. I just wanted to communicate the best way possible and let her know that I applied for a job. But I did not think I was going to get it. I certainly didn't have the experience that was required for the job. They were looking for 5 years of network national radio experience. I had about 2 years of local radio experience at that time. So I truly didn't think I was going to get the job, but I figured you can't ever really know unless you try,
Yeah.
right? And so I applied for the job, and they called me, and I went to ESPN and I interviewed again. And this time I could tell it was a little more serious. And ultimately, they offered me the job and I got the job. I tell people all the time, though, especially those when I was working at ESPN, that this isn't the typical way to get a job at ESPN, because they'll say, how did you get your job? And I'm like, I just applied online and they called me and I interviewed and I got the job. But that's not how it works at ESPN most of the time. Usually the candidates are people that are somewhat handpicked, whatever college they went to. Maybe they had a connection, they knew somebody, they had met someone at a job fair, something that gets their foot in the door. I had nothing. I had zero, other than the fact that I had applied 2 years earlier for that same job. But I got it. And it changed my life, man. I mean, you know this because when you work for a place like ESPN, that's a dream come true for every sports fan.
Hmm.
And, I got to do it for 17 years. And not only did I work at ESPN, but I got to work on some of the biggest shows. Like you mentioned, Mike and Mike, and working on Sports Center and NFL Live, and traveling and going to these events and meeting my sports heroes that I loved as a kid. It was everything you would have imagined a gigantic sports fan would want to have experienced. And yes, there were days that I didn't want to be there and there were bad days, but for the most part, I don't have a bad thing to say about working at ESPN. It was amazing. It was a dream come true.
I love it. As we've been doing these interviews for this podcast, there's been these micro that was stupid moments, right? Like, I mean, there's like the big moment that we're going to talk about, right? But even like you talking about like basically just cold calling, for lack of a better term, ESPN, like that. Well, that's stupid. Like, you're not going to get hired, and you get hired, right?
Totally. Like that's what I felt like too, because I remember I was working as a radio producer at WGY in Albany, New York, and I'm 24, 25 years old, and I loved my job there. Again, I wasn't making a lot of money, but this was, breaking into the business in the most fun way, being at, in my hometown, working on a show where all my family and friends could listen to, just had the best mentors and bosses, to learn and grow from. But one day I'm sitting in the studio and I'm probably editing something and I'm just kind of perusing the internet. Again, it's early in the internet days, right? 1999, 2000. But there was a website called allaccess.com, which I believe still exists. And
Wow.
it's basically I don't know, a treasure trove of news and, highlights and job openings in the radio business. And it was strictly radio at that time. It wasn't TV, it wasn't anything else. It was just radio. And, you'd read about the industry and who's hiring where and what's going on and what did this station do. And you come across job openings and there it is, ESPN radio producer. In fact, yesterday I was going through some old books and there was the job. I had printed it out and I still have that
Wow.
printed out job, uh, I guess, job listing, right, of what it entailed. And yeah, it was stupid, right? Like, okay, I'm going to apply. I mean, I don't have any sports experience really. I don't have the 5 years of required, network radio experience, but who cares? Apply. If they don't call, then I'm very happy with what I'm doing. But if they do call, oh boy, here we go. I'm
Yeah.
in. And if I had just gone to ESPN and interviewed for the job, John, just gone, and I didn't get it, I would still tell that story for the rest of my life because that was the dream, right? Or that was, I don't know, I was the guy who recorded every ESPN Sunday NFL primetime highlight of the Dallas Cowboys, at 18 to 25 years old because I
Yeah.
loved ESPN. I love the Cowboys. I love sports. And so I knew everything about what was on ESPN. I didn't know about the behind the scenes. So I was going to continue to be a fan whether I got to work there or not. And just telling my grandkids someday that I got to interview for a job at this place would have been great. But now I can talk to you and tell you that I got to work there for 17 years. And that was just still to this day, it's really mind blowing when I think about it.
It's kind of like I tell people, and I wrote about this in my book, like, I passed the FBI entrance exam, right? I never
It's,
became an FBI agent, right?
yeah.
But like, I'm going to tell that story to my kids forever. Like, hey, I passed the test, right?
Yes.
I could have
Yeah.
been an
You know where
FBI.
I could have been Jack Bauer. Come
Yeah,
on now. Let's be honest.
exactly. Okay. So you get the job. By the way, how did your wife then react when you moved from Albany to Bristol, when your joke became reality?
Thankfully, it was only a 2 hour drive away. It's not that far, 2 hours. We can do that in our sleep. But I remember her, she's very close to her family. And I remember when I told her that I'd gotten the job, and she had put some parameters on whether we were going to say yes to this job. Like they had to pay me a certain amount of money. They had to, move us to Connecticut from New York and pay for our moving expenses because it was the Disney company. And she figured Disney has some resources. They can do this if they really want you. And they did. They obliged. They met the salary, parameters, if you will, that my wife had put on without them knowing that my wife had put these parameters on.
Wow.
But she cried a little bit, for sure. And she's like, okay, I guess this is the next stage of life. Thankfully, we had many conversations about this radio career that I was in. And there were moments when I told her, I said, listen, most people who work in radio, they're kind of all over the country. They'll go from Albany, New York to Paducah, Kentucky to, you know, Phoenix, Arizona, all the way to, Tacoma, as the song goes. Like they'll be all over the place. And that's kind of what might happen with my career. Are you still in on this relationship? And she said
Mm.
yes. So I think that gave me some confidence to when I was going to tell her, listen, ESPN just came a calling here. It wasn't really ever a pushback from her to say, we're not doing this. We're not going. Sorry, which was great. And I'm we're still in Bristol, Connecticut today. So I'm thankful that we didn't have to move all over the country like I thought we might have to do. But she was wonderful. And she's always been super supportive, not just with that job, but with everything that I've ever done, especially post ESPN, which I know we'll get to, because I've been able to travel a lot more and go and speak and share and write books and stuff like that. And she's still super supportive on everything that I've ever been able to do with my career. So thankfully it's worked out.
So I want to take a break here and just ask, this has always been a burning question of mine, because Bristol, Connecticut I mean, before ESPN, right? It was just kind of this, like, I mean, it's just a very random, and if you've read the book, those guys have all the fun and kind of
Yes.
the history behind ESPN. Like, it's this random town. So, like, do you run into everyone that is on ESPN? Like, I mean, you guys, like, going to the local grocery store and you, like, run into, Steve Levy, or like, what is Bristol like?
Not really. So the interesting thing is Bristol is a 68,000 population town city. It's big, but it's not huge, but it's not tiny either. It's got two high schools. My daughter went to Bristol Central High School here in Bristol. So it's fine, but a lot of the ESPNers don't live in Bristol. So I'm one of the few probably that decided to live in Bristol. And there's a couple of people, there's a few on-air people that live in Bristol, but for the most part, they live in, smaller suburban towns north of Bristol, towns like Avon, Connecticut, or Simsbury, Connecticut, Farmington, those kind of areas. Some even live downstate a little bit more towards New York City, New Haven area, Fairfield, places like that. So I don't run into people all the time, but occasionally I'll see someone. In fact, I was at our Upward Basketball League, a couple months ago, that's held here in Bristol. Our church puts on a church basketball league. And one of the producers, who I hadn't seen in 5 years, was there one day watching. I don't know if he was watching his nephew or his son, but he was there. And I'm like, Tom, is that you? You're like, good to see you, man. How are you? And he's like, I'm doing well. And we just caught up for a few minutes. So occasionally you'll see some behind the scenes people that work at ESPN for sure. My church still to this day has 4 or 5 people that still work at the Worldwide Leader, that live in the Bristol area and go to our church. So there's a few. I mean, there's 3,000 employees in Bristol. So
Yeah.
you're going to run into different people here and there. But it's not like you just go to the gas station and, oh, look, there's Steve Levy and there's Reese Davis and, these
Right.
guys. No, it's not like that at all. Although occasionally that might happen, it's very rare.
Well, thanks for scratching that curiosity, because I always wondered, since reading that book, like
Yeah.
what it's like. Okay, so let's fast forward. So, I mean, you're working at, like you said, the Worldwide Leader. I mean, you're on the top of the mountain, if you will, of
Mhm.
sports, jobs, right?
Yes.
And you start to get an itch. Maybe start to describe when you started feeling like, you know what, maybe there's something more that I need to be doing.
Yeah, so my faith is a big part of this story,
Yeah.
because I don't think if I didn't grow and have a relationship with Christ that this would ever have, ever become an itch, if you will. I was completely content and completely fine with, as long as they would allow me, working at ESPN for the rest of my life. I mean, it was a very comfortable job. It's sports. I mean, come on, they're paying you to watch sports, and they pay you well. And you're working for the Disney company, so you can go to Disney World whenever you want. Like, these are the perks that come with working at a place like ESPN. So why in the world would I ever want to leave? But as I'm growing in my faith and really starting to seek the Lord and loving Jesus and becoming part of a church, and even eventually 10 years after becoming a Christian, I became a Christian in 2001 and gave my life to the Lord. 2013, I'm being asked to be an elder in my church and on the leadership board at my church, which is insanity to me. You want to talk about something stupid? That sounded really stupid. Like, I'm not the guy who went to seminary and, has the Bible memorized or anything like that. So I'm thinking this is impossible. And yet my pastor saw something in me, that I was really passionate about Jesus and passionate about, my family, and he asked me to be on the elder board, and 5 other elders all agreed on it. And I was like, okay, I'll say yes, God, whatever it is you want, I'll say yes to. And that's where the itch, if you will, started coming, this inkling about a year later to, okay, God, I know you want me to do more for you now that I'm in this leadership role, and I just felt a responsibility there. But do you want me to someday think about leaving ESPN? What does that look like? And I ended up at this conference in 2015. I don't think you were at this one, John, the one you and I were talking about. This was in Nashville, Tennessee, and it was called the Best of SMS. And all it was a little gathering of about 50 to 60 men and women who were working in social media for churches and nonprofits and faith-based organizations. And I was invited to speak by I think you know Matt Brown. I was invited by
Yeah.
Matt Brown, and Matt invited me. It was the first time I'd ever been invited to speak at any kind of conference or anything. I wasn't really into speaking or trying even to go down that avenue at all. But he invited me. And what I realized when I got to this conference was that 75 people, 70 people, 60 people, whatever it was, were all doing the same job I was doing at that time, but for a church or for a faith-based nonprofit or something that felt like more purposeful than ESPN. I was the only guy at this conference who worked for a secular organization, much less ESPN, right? But we started sharing, some nuggets and some wisdom and lessons learned, and I just shared my story a little bit and some of what my job was at ESPN. And I realized there are other people doing the exact same thing I'm doing, but for a greater purpose.
Mm.
And that's where the idea started creeping in, like, maybe that's what God wants me to do someday, is to take all the experiences that I got at ESPN, but go do it for something else. And I wasn't, again, looking for a new job. I wasn't even looking to leave ESPN, but this started, I guess it's the Holy Spirit now that I think back, but it just started kind of creeping in my gut that maybe it's time to think about something else. And I was 41 at the time, so it's kind of halftime of life, 42, halftime of life type of scenario. And I thought, well, if this is ever going to happen, it's now, because I don't think if I got to 50, which I'll be this year, if I got to 50, I don't think I'd probably make this move, because by that time you're just looking at kind of coasting the last 10 years and trying to get to retirement, right? And so that was 2015. I didn't leave till 2017. So for the next year and a half, almost 2 years, I really just spent time praying, certainly, but seeking out wise counsel. And what I mean by that is people who didn't work at ESPN, people who weren't affiliated with ESPN. And I just started asking any person that I knew who was, an author, a pastor, just a mentor, somebody that I knew that was not affiliated with ESPN. I just said, can I get 30 minutes of your time? And by the way, while I'm doing this, I'm working at ESPN on Mike and Mike. I had gotten this new role with Mike and Mike in late 2015, and I was loving my job. It was amazing. I'm traveling. I'm having so much fun. I'm working with two of the greatest of all time
Yeah.
on the radio. And the show is just, at its peak. It's on television, it's on the radio, it's on social and digital, which is what I was responsible for. So much great stuff happening. And yet I still felt this burden, this itch, this inkling, if you will, inside me to consider what else might be out there. So I started having conversations with people and just saying, am I crazy that I'm even thinking about this? Am I nuts? And most of them said no. And one
Mm.
person in particular, Brad Lomenick, who I'll name him because Brad knows this story. I don't know if you know Brad. I presume you might have heard of him, but Brad is one of those leadership guru guys, and he's such a great connector. And Brad and I are talking, and I said, am I nuts, bro? And he goes, you're not, but be careful. I said, all right, what do you want me to be careful on? He goes, be careful, because if you leave ESPN, the doors are going to swing so wide open, and God's going to blow your mind at what he's going to do that you might not be ready for it. So be careful.
Wow.
And it was
Wow.
prophetic in some ways, because I'm like, no, he's not. Come on. How could it be Eve? How could he blow my mind after leaving and working at one of the greatest places you'd ever want to work as a sports fan, right? At ESPN. But 6 years later, I look at it and Brad was spot on. He was so right in so many ways. And ultimately, what these conversations that I was having with people led to was a conversation with Steve Stenstrom, who is my boss now. And at the time, he was leading a ministry, and he still is, called Pro Athletes Outreach, PAO. And they had just acquired Sports Spectrum. And Steve, knowing my heart and hearing my desire to do more for the Lord, but also knowing my experience level of 20 years in the business and 17 at ESPN, I don't know. It was just the right timing, John, right? And we were talking, God's timing, of course, and we were talking, and he's like, "Would you ever consider leaving ESPN?" Like he just asked it, and maybe trying to work with us on Sports Spectrum. And I'm like, I think that's what I've been praying for the last year, Steve.
Wow.
I said, but we got to keep praying here because I'm not sure if this is what he wants me to do, but it feels right. And so we kept talking a couple months, and then ultimately we met in Atlanta in the late fall of 2016. And he sat down. He's like, "All right, here's what I can offer you. I can give you 1 year. It's a contract position. I don't have any benefits for you. It's 40% less than what you're making at ESPN. And there's no guarantees here other than we're trusting God to guide both of us." So does this sound stupid
That
saying yes
sounds.
to
I mean,
that?
I'm going to be the one that says that was stupid, right? Like,
Right.
holy cow!
And I initially, when I heard it, I'm like, no, I don't think this is the right move then. Nope. And I didn't tell him this. I'm just kind of thinking inside, like, yeah, that's not going to work. Sorry. And I went home and I told my wife, and she said, that doesn't feel right. Like, you're worth more than that. She was looking at my skills and my value and all that. And I'm
Yeah,
thinking, but if this is from God, nothing can stop it. I need to walk through and say yes, and he'll bless it. He'll take care of it. He'll see us through. And so for the next month or so, we prayed, and I just felt a peace about saying yes to this. I felt like this was the right time. I was 43 and, halftime, whatever you want to call it, of life. And I just felt like this is, if I don't say yes now, it's not going to ever happen. And I also was trying to be obedient to God. And for those listening that might not be, faith generated or religious or whatever, that's something that's important to me. And I feel like if I was saying no and it was coming from God, that I'm literally putting a hand up to the Lord's face and saying, no way, I'm in control. And I don't want to live like that. I want to live open-handed in a way that's obedient and trustworthy to God's plan for my life, not Jason's plan. And yes, did it sound stupid? Absolutely. Yes, did it make no sense at all? I'd say probably it did. But and as I made the decision, and I first told my current boss at ESPN in December, late December, that I was leaving, and I didn't want to leave until mid-February because I felt like the NFL is, prime real estate at ESPN, and
yeah.
I wanted to finish the NFL season with Mike and Mike, get through the Super Bowl, and then leave about a week later. And my boss was super great about it. He didn't tell a lot of people. He kind of kept it under wraps for about another month until January when we started telling some people. And thankfully, because they could have just said, "You're out the door tomorrow," because
Right.
that happens. Thankfully, I think they knew that I was going to work for somebody that wasn't necessarily a competitor. And, I had put a lot of years into working there, that they granted me, a couple weeks, 3 weeks, I think it was, got to finish my time traveling to the Pro Bowl and the Super Bowl with Mike and Mike. And then a week later, that was my last day, February 10th, 2017. And I made what many could have conceived as a stupid decision at the time, or this sounds stupid, but it's the greatest decision in many ways that I've ever made, even more greater than taking the job at ESPN.
Mm.
This decision to leave is exactly what Brad Lomenick predicted. It has blown the doors wide open to things I didn't even see in myself, things that I never knew that I could do or have an experience of. And yeah, it's just been nuts.
So I want to get into, exactly what life has been like now, and what Brad said coming to fruition. But when people at ESPN or colleagues or friends or whoever started hearing that you were leaving, what were they thinking? What were they saying?
Not as it wasn't as bad as you would think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's interesting you asked that because most people who worked at ESPN who knew me knew of my faith. They knew that it was important to me. They saw, scriptures that I would post on social media. I had even started preaching a little bit at my church at that time, and had gone to that conference, so they knew like my faith was really important to me. So when most of them found out what I was going to be doing, faith in sports, oh yeah, that makes sense for Romano. So it wasn't like a shock to them. that I would leave ESPN for something like this because they knew about my faith. Now, there was one person, and I'll leave him nameless for now, but he is a former guy that I worked with, and he loved me. Like, and he always had his best interest for me. He gave me a huge break at ESPN back in 2012 and really helped me kind of take a pretty good leap, not just in salary, but in opportunity with a job. And I remember going to his office about a couple of weeks before I was leaving and I tried to hit everybody up. And when you're there 17 years, there's so many people that you want to say goodbye to and thank. And so he was one of them. And I went over to his office, and his office was like 10 buildings down. So I took a long walk, went over to his office. He's like, "So, I hear you're leaving, huh?" I'm like, "Yeah." I said, "I just feel like this is the right move." And, he's like, "Well, tell me about the job." And I told him, I said, "It's what I told you, 40% pay cut, contract job." And he looked at me and he just goes, "Are you freaking nuts? Like, what's wrong with you?" And I'm loving that he's saying this because I know he has he has my best interest in his mind as he's telling me this. And he says, "Are you crazy? What is wrong with you?" And I said, I just feel like this is the right move, man. I just feel like this is the place that God is calling me to go to." And he's not a Christian or anything like that. Spiritual wise, I don't think there was a lot of faith in that world. God wasn't his thing or whatever, but he knew it was my thing. And he's like, "I just don't care about, whether you think this is the right move, because this is the stupidest move you could ever make. Look what you're leaving."
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, I know what I'm leaving, man. But I've done a lot of praying about this, and I just feel like this is the right move. And he ended it in a good way. Like, "Yeah, I love you and I'm proud of you. And I got, nothing but love for you. And I wish you nothing but the best." He's like, "I'm sorry if I came across harsh." And I'm like, "No, I appreciate it." I said, "You're one of the first few people that actually challenged me on this." Because honestly, John, if I had a bunch of people initially telling me I was nuts and that there's no way I should do this, I probably would have taken that as a hint from God. Like, this probably isn't the right move. But I had a lot of people sort of affirming what I was feeling because they knew my heart, they knew my love for Jesus, and where I was going, and that I wasn't looking to necessarily leave. But this guy was in my face about it, and I thought it was great because I want to hear contrarian views on things sometimes, just to make sure you're challenging yourself and make sure you're making the right move. And ultimately, I still left, but that was the one that I still will remember to this day. Him just like, "What is wrong with you? Are you sure about this? This is stupid. This is crazy." But thankfully, it worked out.
You bring up a good point there too, that I think is great. Like I love for the audience to hear is that, in those "that was stupid" moments, right? You do have the detractors, but you have the people that are affirming it. And in a way, it's kind of like, those detractors, in a sense, give you the ammunition or give you the practice to defend what you feel like is the right decision, right? I mean, like you
Yeah.
said, if everyone is saying, "Oh, this is great," then when you do face, some difficulty or consternation that comes up, you're ready to defend the decision. And I think that's actually a really important point for people to understand. What did Mike Greenberg, Mike Golick, there's a video on the internet of them, I think especially Greenberg, giving you a great send off on air. Really, it makes me emotional, and I'm not even you, right? But what was their reaction?
Initially, when I told them, I Golick was like, "That's really great, really happy for you." Kind of just not a ton there. But Greeny was kind of like, "So, Romano, you're leaving. Like, why are you leaving? What's wrong with you? What's going on here?" Not really challenging me, just kind of like trying to learn more. He's an inquisitive guy. And, I remember telling him about this book that I was working on that I had just started writing, called Live to Forgive. So things were kind of, there was a lot going on in my life between agreeing to write this new book, my first book, and also, leaving ESPN. But there was never really a lot of challenges from either of them. I think they, I don't know how, John, but I didn't talk about my faith a lot in that studio that each morning, for the year that I worked there, that last year. I just kind of lived my life, and I would share my faith on social media and things like that. But I wasn't walking in, and like guys, before we start, let's all pray. Guys, before we start, let me read a verse from John. I wasn't doing that. Obviously, I would have been fired, I think, if I did that. I was trying to be the best producer I could be. But somewhere along the way, they saw that or they knew that, because that send-off that you're referring to, I didn't know that was coming. That was the last 2 minutes of my life working at ESPN, was what that video is. Really. It's the truth.
Yeah.
I came in at 6 a.m. on a Friday morning, February 10th. It was a snowy morning. And I went to the office, and we were covering probably post Super Bowl, doldrums in the NFL that year. I think that was the year that in 2017, that would have been the greatest comeback. So the Patriots beat, the Atlanta Falcons. And so the Patriots are champs. I think we had a couple Patriots in studio that day, possibly. And, we're talking NBA playoffs, and I'm just doing my job. But I also have in the back of my mind, like, this is the last day I'm ever going to work at ESPN. So I was trying to soak it in a little bit. I remember when I parked my car and I just kind of looked out, and I'm like, wow, this place has been so good to me for a long time. And I went in there, did my job. And then at 9:50, and we went off the air at 9:53 usually. And there was like 7 minutes of commercials before, we would come back on at 10 o'clock, or something else would come on at 10 o'clock, usually First Take. Mike and Mike knew they had 2 minutes left. And they're like, before we wrap it up today, I want you to put the camera on Jason Romano. And they put the camera on me, and I was always in the studio, so it was very easy to just kind of turn around. And I just turned over and looked at Mike and Mike, and I just listened for the next 90 seconds. And as you said, Greenberg gave me this wonderful send off, and, talked about, the reason Jason is leaving after working for almost 20 years here is not because he's a big sports fan and he's a really good guy, but he's also a person of faith. And this is why he's leaving, to follow, along on his faith journey. And Golick, was really complimentary too. They were both super nice. But they mentioned my faith, and I'm like, how do they even know? Other than me telling them about the job, but like, I didn't walk around, Bible thumping people. I just tried to
Yeah.
live my life the best way I could. But they knew I was a person of faith, and they knew that I was leaving. That was a big reason why. And they wished me nothing but the best. It was really nice. And they just said, tip of the hat to you, Jason, way to go. And I couldn't have asked for a better send off, because you never know, like, what kind of goodbye that's going to look like. I mean, the show could have just ended, and I would have just been like, all right, that's it. But no, they took 2 minutes on their show to honor me, and that's amazing.
Yeah. And, people who regularly listen to radio, and you being in the industry, how it is. Like someone leaves a show, and it's like the, the thing you don't talk about, right? Like all of a sudden you wake up to your favorite morning show, and it's like a new format, and there's new people, and like no one talks about it. You're like, what happened, right? So that's actually the norm in the industry. So what you got and what they did for you, I think, is just so incredible, and such a testament to your character and who you are. Okay, so Brad Lomenick says, get ready. You're gonna blow God's gonna blow the doors off you.
Yeah.
What? Well, first of all, you were on a year contract, right? So what was that first year like? Were you kind of always thinking, okay, now I got 10 months, now I got 9 months, now I got 6 months, right? Like, did you have this timer in your head, or what was that first year like?
Yeah, it wasn't a timer per se, because I felt like I had the confidence from my bosses to know that this was going to go more than a year, just in our talks, right? It was never like, you got 1 year to prove yourself, Jason. Okay, now you got 6 months to prove yourself, Jason. It was never that. But it was almost, let's start from the Sports Spectrum side, right? So when Sports Spectrum hired me, they really hired me, like I said, as a contract position, 40% pay cut. And it was really only 24 hours a week that they were paying me for, technically, in the contract. And I was tasked to, write some articles and host a podcast, and start a podcast, and then host that podcast. And, I didn't think I was qualified to be able to host anything, if I'm being honest, because I had done 20 years of radio and television, at ESPN and other places, and it was all production. It was producing behind the scenes. But I had been around some of the best interviewers, and they saw something in me that said, you can host this show. So there was a little bit of hesitancy to even start it, because I didn't think I was qualified. or good enough to even do one of these shows. And they gave me about 6 weeks to really put the show together. So I started with Sports Spectrum on February 15th, 2017, and we launched the podcast March 31st, 2017. So it wasn't a whole lot of time. And I didn't know how to launch a podcast, John. I mean, it wasn't
Yeah.
like today where you just, you got all these tools and all these resources. In 2017, I really didn't know where to go or how to even start. So I just went to YouTube and started watching tutorials on how do you start a podcast and how does it even land on Apple? How does it land on, all of these podcast platforms, and how do you edit a podcast? I knew how to edit, but I didn't know what software to use to edit,
Yeah.
right? What kind of microphone do I need? So it was all brand new. So there was an excitement around that. So I wasn't really counting down, the months, if you will, but I really wanted to do good work. And I just figured if I can do good work, like that's going to allow me to, I guess, prove myself and let, my bosses see, okay, we can't let this guy go because he does good work. And if I did crappy work or terrible work, then that would have been an easy goodbye. We're moving on from you. And 6 years later, I'm still there. I'm full time now, and I've been full time for almost 4 years. So God saw that through, right? But that first year, I was also kind of wrestling with maybe I could do this sports spectrum thing part time and do other things, because I was finishing up my first book. And, people were telling me when you write a book, you're going to get opportunities to speak. And when you speak, you're going to get opportunities to speak again. And, I also thought about consulting because I had so many years of working at ESPN that I was like, there's got to be some value there. And I got a couple clients and actually worked with some people for a good portion of that year on the side, just, working with them to help them on their career path in the world of broadcasting. So things were kind of all over the place that first year. And by the time it was over, I remember some of my bosses at Sports Spectrum saying, so what do you want to do here? Because you're kind of part-time with us and you're kind of half in with us, even though I wasn't half in, just by the nature of what the contract was. And I was consulting and speaking a little bit. And I'm like, well, I like doing it all. I said, but I really, really like doing this podcast. I said, it's my favorite thing to do. And I said, so if I was to choose, which nobody's ever made me choose, so just put that out there.
Yeah.
But if I had to, it would be Sports Spectrum. So I wanted them to know, like, I'm in on this. If you guys ever want to expand a position or work towards keep doing this, like I'm in on Sports Spectrum before I am on speaking or certainly writing books. I didn't want to do that. It's something that just kind of came about. But I do love speaking and I do love consulting when I'm asked, but my passion, my desire is to keep doing what we're doing with Sports Spectrum, at least right now. And 6 years later, that's what's happening. So it's good that you asked that question though, because that first year is strange and different. I went into the office with 3,000 people every day at ESPN, and suddenly I'm working out of the spare bedroom of my house in Connecticut and traveling once a month to Colorado, where Sports Spectrum's offices are located. So that was a big adjustment for me. My daughter, I think at the time was seventh or eighth grade. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't neglecting her, even though I was traveling more. But I also had more freedom. Like she was playing softball, and if she had a 5 o'clock game, I could leave. I didn't have to report to anybody necessarily. As long as I was getting my work done, I didn't have to miss anything. And that wasn't always the case at ESPN. So there were good and bad parts to it initially. And it was a big adjustment. But now it's been 6 years, and I feel like, I got a really good rhythm under my belt to know how this works. And, I'm full time with Sports Spectrum. I don't do anything else other than I'll speak maybe 7 to 10 times a year, or whenever somebody asks me if I'm available. I'll try to make that work. And I love speaking, but my purpose and my focus is on Sports Spectrum.
Was there ever a moment in the last 6 years where you're like, maybe not regret, but where you're like, oh man, or it would be nice to if I was, back at ESPN or doing any moments like that?
I'll tell you something that's you'll probably laugh at. Yeah, when I went to Disney World for the first time and had to pay out of my own pocket. And that's the truth. I mean, we went in probably 2019, I think it was around Christmas time, And, it was a couple years after I had left ESPN, and we bought the tickets and took our daughter, and it was the three of us, my wife, my daughter, and myself. And, that was the first time that I actually had to pay full price to go to Disney World, because ESPN was owned by Disney, and I had all these free passes. And I was like, whoa, it's like $1,000 for just to walk into the park for three of us.
Yeah.
And so then at that moment, I looked at Sarah. I'm like, man, can you imagine if I was still at ESPN? This is all free. And so that's kind of a lighthearted moment or a
Sure,
funny
sure.
moment. But I never really had a moment, John, to be honest with you. I mean, I miss the people, and there are moments when you miss, like, if you get caught up in the pride of working there and the sort of prestige that comes with it. You miss a little bit of that, I think, initially, but I was also really focused on growing Sports Spectrum. And what's interesting is when I left, I still got to be around and work with and interview some pretty big names in the world of sports and grow and build relationships that I didn't have when I was at ESPN. So God, he really has blown the doors in ways that I didn't imagine, as Brad Lomenick said would happen, because of the fact that I'm still working in sports. I love sports. I'm hosting a show, still getting to do that. I'm leading a team. We're continuing to push the ante and trying to improve our content and improve our opportunities to tell greater stories. And I'm hosting a show. Like, I'm doing some of the things that I always wanted to do, but in a completely different way than I ever thought I could do. And so who am I to complain, right? And so I
Yeah.
don't really, I tell people now, I don't miss ESPN at all. I miss the people, some of the guys that I worked with, some of the women that I worked with, friends that will be friends for the rest of my life, people that I still talk to today, so many of them. But I don't miss going into the office and working in the way that we used to, compared to what I get to do now. Like, the work I get to do now trumps the work that I had then 100-fold, because it's more important work.
Yeah.
It's more purposeful work. It's sharing the gospel. If we're going to be honest here, it's using the world of sports to point people to Jesus. Like, that's way more important to me than any booking or guest that I ever could have gotten or worked with at ESPN. As much as I love doing that, this work that I'm doing now is way more important to me than the work I ever did at ESPN.
And that's what's so cool is following your your journey. Like I said, we met right when you were kind of
Yeah.
deciding whether to leave, and now it's like, I mean, you're at the Super Bowl every year, right? Like, you're one of those guys that on media day that is bringing people to the side, and you're interviewing them, and I mean, every big name in sports you have interviewed or will interview, right? I mean, it's just it's incredible to see what that journey looks like now. How many podcasts have you done? I mean, there wasn't a podcast, but now how many episodes have you done?
We were counting until we got to 1,000, and I'm like, I can't count anymore. This is too many. And there was a moment, the reason we got to that number so quick, I think, was because in 2018, I became like super ambitious, and I proposed to my bosses to do this as a daily show. I'm like, yeah, let's do it every day. We could 5 guests a week. Let's go. Just like a radio show. And my bosses were like, yeah, if you think you can, go for it. And I realized about a year after doing that, maybe even less than a year, that I'm like, this is just too much. Like, people don't listen to podcasts the way that they listen to a radio show. So you can't, it's just too much. And it was just too much for us too. And so we trimmed it down to 3 episodes a week, which is still a lot, but it's not 5. And it's much more manageable. But the number is somewhere in the range of 1,200 podcasts, I think,
Wow.
now that we've done, which is mind boggling. In fact, if you go to Apple, it'll actually tell you when you click on Sports Spectrum podcast, how many episodes that there are, since launch. And it says, like, I think 1,220 or something. I don't even know what the
Wow.
number is now, but it's just crazy, John, to think that there's that many out there. But it's one at a time, right? Like, every interview you just sit down and you focus on. And I hope that all of the people that we've talked to over the years, big names and a lot of people you've never heard of, my goal was always just to keep Jesus in the sports conversation and point people to him. And I think every person that we've had, for the most part, has a story that they can share. And that's what I love. Like, can I have them share their story on our platform for people to, be encouraged and be you know, I don't know, just be inspired by to be able to kind of walk a similar path in some way. And that's what we get to do. Like even today, we have an NFL wide receiver, releasing on our podcast. And that NFL wide receiver 3 years ago didn't even think he would be in the league. And now he had, an incredible run late in the season and gets in the playoffs and has a great game in the playoffs, and he gets his deal, and he's going to play next year and be one of the main cogs for a team that was in the playoffs in 2022. So you just never know what kind of guests we're going to have on and the people that we get to meet and talk to. But I love my job, dude. I mean, I think you can feel
Yeah.
that same way where it's like I wouldn't ever want to do anything else. The key is not to get caught up just saying you love your job though and thinking that's just enough. Like you have to keep putting in the work, and you have to keep working hard and, making sure that you're giving your best effort and obviously trusting God. But man, when you love your job, it's true. You don't really ever work a day in your life.
So let me, as we kind of wrap it up here, what do you feel like is the lesson or lessons of your "that was stupid" story?
Well, there's a lot of lessons. The first one that comes to mind is to trust God. I know it's kind of bland and, very cliche-ish in that way, but I mean that. Like there was this stirring in my spirit for almost 2 years. And there were moments where I was kind of pushing it off, or I'm like, this can't be real, is it? Or is this really birthing something that's going to happen? And ultimately it did. And I'm glad that I was obedient. And that's probably the second lesson, like trust God and try to be obedient to him when he's making something fairly clear to you that you should step into. But also don't be afraid, because I really said this to my wife. I said, listen, if this is from God, this move, this stupid move, if you will, I said, he'll see it through. But if
Hmm.
this is from Jason, it'll probably fall flat on my face. And if that's the case, okay, I'll go back to ESPN or I'll go find another job. And so, yes, there's fear there. I think a lot of people have fear of change and fear of like trying something different because what if it fails? Well, what if it doesn't fail? You'll never know unless you try. Even going back all the way 23 years ago and applying for that job at ESPN, what's the worst they could have done? Nothing. They
Yeah.
could have seen my name, put it in the trash, moving on, next person. But they didn't. And so you never know unless you try. And I think that's a huge lesson for me, even in that sort of stupid moment 6 years ago, which turned out to be an amazing moment for me, was you never know unless you try. And that first year, like we just talked about, was a lot of trial and error. But as I kept stepping into that space over that first year, I kept realizing I think this is right where God wants me to be. And when you're in that moment, you kind of know. You
Yeah.
don't know often when you're thinking about it. And even when you look back, you can certainly see how God's plan kind of was orchestrated. But there are moments when you feel like, man, I am just in a sweet spot right now. And that was what I felt after probably a few months. I realized, wow, this team that I work with, they genuinely care about me. They're allowing me to spend time with my family. They want me to prioritize my relationship with God and my family and my marriage and my daughter over my job. They're telling me that. And yet they still want me to produce great work and be the best employee that I could be too. But they're telling me, listen, prioritize your family.
Mm.
And they've done that over 6 years now in a way that I never saw at ESPN. And that's not a knock on ESPN. ESPN is great, but they're there to get people in to do the work to help them make money. And ultimately, Sports Spectrum probably looks at it in a similar fashion, but they care about me. And, I would have never known that when I said yes initially. I just thought it was a cool job and kind of following God's call. So don't be afraid, trust God, try to be obedient. I mean, those might be lessons that you hear in a lot of different areas, but I experienced those firsthand, and I really believe they're true.
Man, this is awesome. Thank you for sharing all of that. I mean, I knew it was going to be a great interview, but like, true to what Brad said, blew my doors off. Um, where people can go to sportspectrum.com. They can
Yeah.
find the podcast wherever great podcasts are sold, as they say.
Yes,
But
sir.
how about your books, right? You have Live to Forgive, you have The Uniform of Leadership. Where can people go to get more information or get those books, more info about you personally?
Yeah, I have a website. I update it maybe every 2, 3 months. It's jasonromano.com. It's got like speaking engagement stuff on there, and it's got information on the books and where you can purchase them. But you can always get them at Amazon, obviously, in the places where books are sold. But yeah, and I'm on social media a lot, mostly Twitter and Instagram right now. Twitter is an interesting time to be in that space, but I still love Twitter. I still love being on that platform, and my DMs are open pretty regularly for those platforms. So if anybody needs to reach me, it's pretty easy to do.
Well, Jason Romano, thank you so much for joining the That Was Stupid podcast, for sharing your story, for sharing your faith, and for encouraging people to take those chances, right? That may seem scary at the time, and yet look what happens. Jason, thank you so much for joining us.
You are welcome, John. Thanks for having me, buddy.
Well, wow, I don't know about you, but that was awesome. I loved hearing those details. I had known Jason when he was going through kind of the internal struggle on whether to take this leap, and I think the encouragement that he offers is great for anyone listening to this podcast that has a big decision, that was stupid moment. Hopefully you take what Jason said and incorporate it into your own decision making. Once again, subscribe to the podcast. If you have suggestions for us, again, you can email me, us, the whole team, guest@thatwasstupid.show. Thanks again, and be sure to share. If you know someone who might really like this, I'd love for you to send it to them. We'll see you next time.